Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the first hearing of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly's Working Group on the establishment of a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO itself. With less than 2 weeks before the NATO summit in Brussels, we find ourselves at a key junction. Our transatlantic alliance of democracies is confronted with a new global competition in our values. Autocrats in Moscow and Beijing and elsewhere are promoting alternative models of governance, and they're targeting the principles and institutions at the heart of our democratic societies. Democracy is resilient, but as we learned on January 6th, if we needed a reminder, it can also be fragile. This is a lesson all of us need to assimilate. And that's why we must constantly work to protect it and strengthen our ability to counter those who seek to undermine it from within and from without. The Washington Treaty makes clear that NATO is an alliance of democracies. Without this commitment to shared democratic values, NATO would be, frankly, just another competing military bloc. Our alliance has both the resources and the tradition to face today's challenges and to persevere. We must rededicate ourselves to those democratic foundations explicitly, not just through statements in communiques, but by creating architecture and taking concrete actions to foster and protect and promote democracy itself. I'm firmly convinced we must anchor this commitment to democracy within NATO by establishing a Center for Democratic Resilience. We first proposed the creation of such a center on the occasion of NATO's 70th anniversary 2 years ago. Since then, the Assembly as a whole endorsed that proposal, and the independent group of experts on NATO 2030 supported that notion in their recommendations to the NATO Secretary General. In April of this year, the Assembly established the working group to refine the concept. As chair of the working group, I'm joined by the rapporteur, Vice President Attila Mesterhazy, and our former president, as well as our extended bureau and the chairperson of our recently named Committee on Democracy and Security. We've already had a number of consultations with experts and officials and received several testimonies, but I'm glad the whole working group can now hear directly from two of the most prominent experts on NATO, Rose Gottmerle and Dan Hamilton, who both have a distinguished past with NATO. Today's discussions will help us sharpen the proposal and let us work through some of the political and practical questions before submitting a final proposal. Our goal is to ensure that this discussion on values is clearly identified as a priority at the NATO summit itself, as well as in the updated strategic concept. First, we'll hear from Ms. Gottmerle. She is the Payne Distinguished Lecturer at the Center for International Security and Cooperation and Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Of course, most of us remember Ms. Gottmerle from her time at NATO Deputy Secretary General between 2016 and 2019, where she was a frequent visitor with us at NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Hamilton. He is the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Global Europe Program and the Wilson Center. Like Ms. Gottmerle, he also has a long and distinguished diplomatic career, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs at the United States Department of State, where he was responsible for, among other things, NATO. Without further ado, Rose Gottmerle, the floor is yours. Welcome.
And we're bringing her on screen.
Mr. President, it's a pleasure to see you this morning from California, where we do not have any cicadas. I'm very happy to report. And I also wanted to greet Vice President Mesterhazy and the members of the committee who are listening today. It's an honor to appear before you today to discuss a Center for Democratic Resilience for NATO. This is an important initiative that gets at the heart of bolstering NATO's founding principles at a time of profound change. Democratic principles and the rule of law are inscribed in the preamble of NATO's founding document, the Washington Treaty, just as you noted, Mr. President, and every ally must ascribe to them. But implementation has become ragged or weakened, sometimes dangerously so, during the recent period. I thank you for shining a spotlight on the issue during this year of the 2030 review. It is very timely, and I am glad also that you took note of the upcoming NATO summit, where I think there is a real opportunity to continue to shine a light on the issue and maybe to get some important decisions made to bolster democratic resilience at NATO. I wanted to begin by endorsing Mr. Hamilton's excellent testimony, which stresses the need for a reaffirmation of NATO foundational values and adopting, as he puts it, a dynamic, comprehensive approach to resilience across the alliance. I must say we do have one difference in how we couch our recommendations, which I will get to as I wrap up my remarks. But first, I wanted to note that I have not prepared written testimony in advance of this hearing, but I will be glad to submit these remarks for the record if you would find it useful.
Thank you.
I would like to reflect on my own experience as NATO Deputy Secretary General and what I have observed as working most effectively to bolster NATO's approach to democratic resilience inside the alliance. The issue was highlighted repeatedly during my time at NATO, not only in the wrong direction of travel that we have all observed among some NATO allies, but also in important studies that have been undertaken. Mr. Hamilton's work, of course, but also work by Nicholas Burns and Douglas Lute, which garnered major attention at NATO headquarters and among NATO leadership while I was still at NATO. I must say many events, and I know, sir, your concern is with the events here in the United States in January. Many events have occurred since I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO, but my remarks today are rooted in my own experience at NATO, and so please do bear that in mind. First, and again from my own experience, I can attest to the deft private diplomacy that was a constant feature of my time at NATO, and I think is the strongest tool that is available to the NATO leadership, the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, and the Assistant Secretaries General, as well as their deputies inside the NATO institution. All are keenly aware of this issue and in their daily work with the allies and with the partners, I may say, work to develop and to bolster democratic resilience. The current NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, is especially skilled at reaching out privately to counterparts. I will note that he was in very close contact repeatedly with Mr. Erdogan, President Erdogan in Turkey, for example, and I observed last summer that he was instrumental in ensuring that NATO allies, Turkey and Greece, did not end up in a crisis situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, although they came perilously close to that over petrochemical resources there. But I do think that the Secretary General has been very deft over time with everything from his private communications via text messages to phone calls, visits to capitals, every way possible to work and ensure that both NATO allies are continuing to work together smoothly, but they are aware also of their responsibilities to the NATO Founding Act and to the democratic principles and the rule of law that are inscribed therein. So that is one important way that I think NATO continues to really work these issues in a quiet way. Quiet diplomacy, I think, has been very valuable in this regard, and I hope that your committee continues it. I will say that this has also been important with regard to the NATO partners. As Deputy Secretary General, I have had personal experience working with our NATO partner, Serbia, including with President Vučić himself, in trying to convey these messages and trying to convey the necessity of finding ways to negotiate in order to settle disputes in the region and to work in this way rather than in, well, I will say, ways that are under the rug, so to say, very popular in that part of the world, in the Western Balkans, but to work directly with counterparts at the negotiating table to try to solve important problems. It was also my experience working with the then leader in Moldova, Dodon, in Chisinau, and to try to bolster the important message that NATO and NATO partnership had much to do to strengthen Moldova as an independent state, and not in any way to interfere with its other cooperation with other powers such as Russia, because of course NATO is firm in its principle that every nation should have the opportunity to choose its own security relationships, its own partnerships, and its own alliances. So I wanted to also stress that point that NATO is effective, I believe, in working on issues of democratic resilience, not only with allies, but also with its partners across the world. Second, I would like to point to what I call the inside-out approach to working these issues at NATO and with NATO allies through consistent embrace of democratic values and the rule of law in our everyday approach to policy, to training, and to exercises. The example I like to cite is the application of international humanitarian law to targeting. This is a consistent and persistent message across the alliance, and again is deeply imbued in our approach to training and exercises. And this translates, in my view, into a group of senior military officers as well as soldiers from across the alliance who are schooled in these values. I believe the results have been impressive over time. Again, this is not only reflecting on my own experience as NATO's Deputy Secretary General, but also reflecting on the history of the NATO alliance. And I have pointed to the prominent example of the Salazar regime in Portugal, which was, excuse me, an example of when NATO has cohabitated with dictatorships over time, and in fact, it has done so persistently throughout its career. But the inside-out approach to working these issues at NATO, in fact, produced a group of senior military officers who were instrumental in the so-called Carnation Revolution in 1974 that brought democracy back to Portugal. I want to underscore that this inside-out approach, as I call it, is not in any way meant to subvert national governments. It is, in fact, a quiet way of working to instill democratic values and to bring them to the fore so that when nations and their populations are ready to move forward in a democratic approach, they are prepared to do so. It is a leadership building approach, but not in any way as I think about it, a way of driving revolution in the countries in the NATO alliance. I also want to make that clear that this is a quiet approach to building democratic values, but it has been a successful and important way to build democratic values inside the alliance. The third area that I would like to emphasize is the active display of the principles of democracy in everything that NATO does to show its public face. I will reflect on the so-called crisis management exercise in 2018 in Norway, which again I experienced personally as Deputy Secretary General, and the impressive approach that NATO took to complete transparency and confidence building during this exercise. Not only with the Russian Federation, of course, everyone very concerned about Russia as a possible aggressor against NATO, but also with the Norwegian public, working steadily and intensively at a time when NATO trucks and equipment were rolling around the Norwegian countryside and might have led to a good deal of tension and anxiety among the Norwegian public. But NATO did everything it could to show NATO's openness, working closely with the public for the length of the exercise, also showing a close working relationship among the member states, a display of allied unity that I think that was unparalleled, with cooperation on display from the smallest members to the largest, and an open invitation to observe to other states, including partner states, but also prominently to the Russians. So this aspect of what I think of as complete transparency is very important to, again, the approach to democratic values in the alliance. And it is something that NATO has on display every day in its approach to public affairs and public diplomacy, and works hard to continue to develop in more sophisticated ways as the social media supercharge more negative messages directed at the alliance. So NATO must be very activist in this way and has continued to develop strengths in this regard. These three examples lead to my two recommendations. First of all, and here I'm in complete agreement with Mr. Hamilton, I recommend that NATO should indeed reaffirm its foundational values in the context of the NATO 2030 review and the process of redoing the strategic concept. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, I know this is also a recommendation that you wholeheartedly embrace. I do think it's important that these issues are front and center at this time and that NATO be sending clear messages about them. I can also recommend that NATO look for ways to expand resilience in this arena with the establishment of an institutional structure affiliated with NATO. And I've read and reflected on your very good website, Mr. President, and I've taken these words mindfully from the website, the establishment of an institutional structure affiliated with NATO. I do have one difference with Mr. Hamilton's approach, however. He recommends that the ASG, the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, that institution or that office within the alliance headquarters be the site of a center that would work directly with allies who have some work to do with the issues of democratic resilience, some work to do to resolve those issues. I fear that such a center would get buried in the overwhelming agenda that PASP already supports. It is the nexus for policy work not only inside the alliance, but with the NATO partners and interlocutors across the world, from Colombia to Australia and New Zealand, with China as an important interlocutor of NATO in between. So I fear the center would get buried in PASP. First, I also have some concerns and doubts that it could be effective inside the alliance, given that NATO member states will have to be willing to interact and work with the center in order to begin to rectify some of the problems that are found in their national governance systems. And I do have some doubts about its ability to be effective in that regard, particularly, as I said, as the energy of PASP is so caught up with dealing with allies and partners as well as interlocutors across the world. I recommend instead to focus on an alternative approach that would emphasize the Center of Excellence concept. NATO has developed a dynamic network of centers of excellence in recent years that are working on some of the most troubling issues with which the alliance is contending. They tend to be the site of the best policy innovation in the alliance and are increasingly being pushed to work together to join forces against the challenges that NATO faces: cyber attacks, misinformation campaigns, the whole panoply of hybrid challenges. Indeed, the NATO-EU Center of Excellence on Hybrid Threats that has been cited in the current proposal as a model for developing cooperation with the EU on democratic resilience, I think this is a very good idea, and I do fully endorse it. I believe you could go farther, however, and that focusing on such a NATO-EU Center of Excellence on democratic resilience would be the best way to bring innovation to bear on this important problem, to fully engage not only allies and partners. And furthermore, I am glad to note that Romania has already offered to host such a center. So I would ask simply, sir, that you reflect on my recommendation. I understand that there are alternative approaches on the table, but I hope to lead to some discussion within your committee, and happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much for this opportunity to testify, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, and I look forward to your questions and our discussion. Thank you very much.
Mr. Connolly had to step out for 1 second. Thank you very much, Ms. Scott Miller, for getting us off to a great start. Now I'd like to turn things over to Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton, the floor is yours.
And we'll get him on screen right away.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Everything all right?
Yep,
Yes?
all good.
Okay. Thank you so much. Rose Guttermiller is a hard act to follow, so I've always had great admiration for her, so it's a privilege to be here with her today. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, Rosandra and company, thank you for giving us this opportunity. I did provide written testimony, so that is available. Let me briefly summarize the premise of that testimony. I strongly support the recommendation that NATO establish a coordination center for democratic resilience. I do believe such a center is likely to have best success if its mandate and its responsibilities are clearly delineated as part of an overall reaffirmation by alliance leaders of NATO's foundational values and as an integral element of an alliance commitment to make what I call comprehensive resilience NATO's fourth core task as we undertake a strategic concept review. As President Connolly said at the very beginning, much of the strategic discussion in recent years is focused on competition among states of quote, great power. But it's becoming very clear, at least to me it seems, that this competition extends beyond traditional measures of power. It centers increasingly on forms of governance. Adversaries, big and small, are selling autocracy as efficient. They tout their systems and they use a broad array of tools to amplify the seams and gaps within our democracies to undermine confidence and to weaken those democracies. And if they can't do that successfully, they use diplomatic and other means of coercion. They support illiberal democracy. And others are starting to follow that model. This is what puts democratic resilience at the heart of a new international system we're seeing emerging. It's a fundamental issue for the next few decades, and NATO must focus on it. So the security case, I think, needs to be made for democratic resilience. And my take on it would be that by integrating democratic resilience more fully into NATO's mission, it's not an additional task, it is a foundational task. The democratic values and institutions upon which the alliance has been founded are under assault from external and internal challengers. And allies, countries with weak protections for democracy, individual liberty, rule of law, are vulnerable to subversion, to corruption, mis and disinformation. And over the recent years, I would argue some waning attention to NATO's core values has resulted in some allies prioritizing unilateral national decisions over collective alliance interests, or using their positions to block alliance activities as a way to gain some leverage in their own bilateral disputes. Some allies, if we're honest, are also manipulating information and distorting data themselves, engaging in cyber attacks on opponents and undermining democratic processes and the rule of law, even threatening each other. These points of disunity within the alliance can be used by strategic competitors to destabilize individual allies or NATO as a whole. Malign influences within allied states could mean that non-NATO countries could influence NATO decision-making. So in each of these ways, the deficits in internal values can become external threats. One of my colleagues, Celeste Wallander, has called democratic fragility the alliance's, quote, Achilles heel. And I think we need to pay more attention to that. And the best defense, the most formidable line of defense against such threats are resilient democratic institutions with robust and transparent mechanisms of accountability. Resilient democracies are historically less likely to experience intra-state conflict, interstate conflict, generate refugees, harbor violent extremists. They're better at maintaining transparent institutions, civilian control of military and intelligence services, building trust and confidence with each other and with other countries, all of which are core features of NATO's ability to collectively defend its members, manage crisis, and cooperate with partners, NATO's three core tasks. So the alliance, in my view, needs to restore its liberal democratic foundations and dedicate greater effort to detect and expose and counter external authoritarian influence if it's going to reduce its vulnerability to corruption, blackmail, information warfare, cyber intrusions, and disruptions of critical infrastructure. I do believe that efforts to advance democratic resilience, however, will have best success if integrated into a broader concept of what I call comprehensive resilience, and to lift that as a new core task for NATO. None of the other three core tasks really take on this spectrum of security challenges, and if we can make resilience more effective, it'll improve all of the other three core tasks. So it does seem to me an important area that we need to focus on. My critique of NATO so far, while I agree NATO has stepped up on resilience, except for the Alliance's cyber defense pledge and the country-by-country baseline requirements that the Alliance has established, these considerations have not yet been really adequately integrated into NATO's planning, its operational activities, or its understanding as a mission, as an alliance of democracies. And my critique has been that the baseline requirements are really focused on critical infrastructure and their country-by-country requirements, as if one country can show it's resilient and that's all it needs to do. But if we think about how interconnected our alliance is, how interconnected European societies are, it doesn't matter really how resilient you are if your neighbor isn't. So we have to advance a concept which the Secretary General started to use of shared resilience, not just country-by-country requirements, but regional or neighboring countries need to understand the vulnerabilities of each other. The other piece that seems to me along the spectrum of resilience is that so far NATO is focused on resilience unto itself, just resilient allies, whereas I believe that we have to think about how to project resilience forward to weaker societies along NATO's periphery, key partners such as Ukraine. If you think about what's happening in Ukraine today, Ukraine is being used as a laboratory by particularly Russian actors to sort of test out disruption. Yeah, if it works there, they take it on the road. The solar winds attack in the United States, most recently, in which malware was implanted all through U.S. Agencies and critical infrastructures, was a successor to the NotPetya attacks that had happened in Ukraine some years ago. David Sanger, one of the New York Times columnists, said, if it works in Kiev, it works everywhere. And that you can see that this is the thing. So simply because Ukraine is not a NATO ally doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about its resilience. And if you think about that in the Western Balkans, other countries, it is, as Rose had said, a key element of how we can work on cooperative security. It gives us a new element to work on with our partners. So I believe there's a broader spectrum here. And in terms of just concluding with my specific recommendations, because this is such a foundational issue, I believe we need to, as some have said, affirm our vows, either with a new Atlantic Charter or a preface to a new strategic concept that is fundamental about alliance of values, an alliance of democracies. However that's written, I think it's a fundamental foundation for much else that is done. I mentioned that as part of the strategic concept review, I think the alliance should really take a strong look at whether comprehensive resilience could become a fourth core task for the alliance, which would operationalize a lot of these concepts. We need to understand, it seems to me also, that resilience involves so much of our civilian societies and critical infrastructures, and that within Europe, the European Union also has a large role to play here. And in fact, despite of all the talk about so-called strategic autonomy and all of that, resilience is actually the leading edge of NATO-EU cooperation, not anything else. And we should build on that. We should open that up because, again, much of the civilian infrastructure is more in the EU bailiwick than in NATO, and we need to engage private actors. In terms of specifics for democratic resilience within NATO, My concern is that if we push democratic resilience as a standalone issue, it's likely to encounter significant pushback. Some allies may feel targeted. It'll invite very divisive debates because some allies may accord higher priority to other elements of resilience. It could pit some allies against each other as they come forward with pet projects. Whereas if we open this up, democratic resilience is an element of a comprehensive resilience, the spectrum of resilience that I've been discussing, and do this through the strategic concept review. That provides an inclusive alliance-wide process that would be seen as legitimate, through which allies can assess mechanisms to uphold their mutual commitment to strengthen free institutions, which is in the North Atlantic Treaty, and open up more policy space for allied agreement on a number of specific mechanisms. I take Rose's point about and her concern about some of the institutional recommendations, but nevertheless, let me make my case for this. It seems to me one option to consider is, in fact, to create the position of a NATO Inspector General as a strong institutional ombudsman, working outside the chain of command and reporting to the Secretary General. There is no NATO IG. That is a best practice in many, many institutions, and yet there's nothing in the North Atlantic Alliance. In terms of President Connolly's specific suggestion, and in terms of this notion of the Coordination Center for Democratic Resilience, I do believe we should give NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security a remit to oversee a regular review of allied commitments to democratic principles as enshrined in the North Atlantic Treaty. My testimony provides exactly which articles of the North Atlantic Treaty are relevant to this point. I won't go over that right now. But I think a regular review process is a healthy thing for an alliance of democracies, and that it needs to be at NATO headquarters. You could elaborate a code of conduct for allied states under the North Atlantic Treaty, which was proposed by the NATO experts group. One could monitor such a center and identify challenges to democracy, human rights, rule of law in allied states. It could oversee a democratic resilience review mechanism with individual allies, a systematic process by which allies all go through the same review, an annual report on democratic resilience, an in-house resource for issues for allies that might like that help, and increase transparency with regard to foreign influence activities, which I think is much needed now, to help work with allied governments to encourage the sharing of good practice and establishment of foreign influence transparency registers. And then to be NATO's liaison on these issues with a number of the other institutions that we've discussed. I don't disagree that a Euro-Atlantic Center on Resilience is a good idea. I think it is a good idea, and that's my point. I think we should we should not reduce this to an either-or choice. Resilience is becoming such an important topic, we need to do more in a number of fronts. So Romania's offer to stand up a Euro-Atlantic Center on Resilience, which was not a NATO center, it would be for both NATO and EU, similar to the one that's in Helsinki. We could open that also, in my view, to NATO's enhanced opportunities partners, like Ukraine, or Sweden or Finland. That seems to me something that could be good. And my point is that it's important to delineate the responsibilities of the center that we discussed and this Euro-Atlantic Center in Romania. The CCDR, the one that President Connolly, I think in particular, is pushing, in my mind, would be focused narrowly on democratic resilience among allied states. It would be more operational. It would be tied into senior NATO leadership. It would formulate NATO assessments and focus on infusing democratic resilience into implementation of NATO core tasks. The Romania Center, in contrast, would focus on deep analysis and review of good practice when it comes to the broad spectrum of resilience challenges. It's not a center on democratic resilience they're proposing, but on resilience generally. So it's not limited to that. It could be open to EU members and to other countries. It could provide advice and training and assistance on election integrity, security, toolkits to help prevent violence around elections or anticipate democratic backsliding, conduct research on disruptive challenges to comprehensive resilience. Those are, in my mind, are not competitive. The Romania Center would extend and take on a broader spectrum of challenges, but would be less operational, whereas the center at NATO headquarters would be focused on the alliance per se and tied into the senior leadership. So I propose in my testimony a number of other specific suggestions on moving forward, but let me stop there. I think any number of institutional steps could be imagined. NATO could structure any number of processes and procedures to bolster democratic resilience and counter external efforts to disrupt our democracies. In the end, success is going to depend less on bureaucratic tweaks, it seems to me, than on allies' will to uphold the principles of the North Atlantic Treaty. Once we can reaffirm that, I think there is opportunity to get more specific with these or other proposals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton. Really thoughtful remarks from both you and former Deputy Secretary General Guttmacher. Let me just react. I think both of you have really presented some very thoughtful recommendations and insights. I start from the premise that democracy is both resilient and fragile. And right now I want to focus on strengthening the former and addressing the latter. We have a tendency in international organizations to dilute everything to the least common denominator. You know, what's the least objectionable? And right now we can't afford that when it comes to democracy. And after 70 years, we still don't have any architecture unique to ourselves in NATO that addresses what we say are foundational principles. That's remarkable. That's extraordinary. And it's not like democracy is something we can just take for granted because look, everywhere manifestly it's strong and vibrant and resilient and robust and, you know, clearly beats the competition every time. And so it's under assault, both from within and from without. And creating an operational center, absolutely, within NATO, not as an outside center, because then you're saying democracy is just, it's on a par with our concerns about cyber or interoperability or whatever it might be. No. This is the other pillar. We're about shared democratic values and we're about collective security to support those. Otherwise, as I said, we're just another military bloc. You can choose to be a member or not. That's competing with other blocs. Well, we're competing with, as you said, Dr. Hamilton, you know, malign authoritarian systems who are aggressively selling their system as a more efficient alternative. And are we going to respond to that or not? And so I think we have to do it operationally. Now, I think there's nothing precluding, once we create an architecture of our own that enshrines democratic resilience as the other pillar with collective security, it can be a resource center. It can be a benchmarking center. It can look at best practices. It can be a consultant to not only NATO members, but aspiring NATO members. As I think you cited Ukraine. There'd be nothing to preclude our helping Ukraine or Georgia or anybody else who wants to see, well, what are the best, how do you have an independent judiciary? What are some models I can look for? You know, there are those who say, well, those kinds of institutions exist here, there, and elsewhere. Why not just refer them? Again, I'm offended by that in a sense because I'm thinking, so NATO, that says it's a foundational principle, its commitment to democracy, wants to farm out democratic references to some other groups. It's not important enough for us to be a resource and seen as a resource because that's why we formed this alliance. And so I'm pretty passionate about this, and so is the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And we're pretty committed to making sure that whatever we do with respect to democratic resilience, and by the way, Dr. Hamilton, I wouldn't preclude your idea of broadening resilience so that it's enshrined in there, but there are some other aspects of resilience we want to work at. and you listed, human rights and several others. That might work. I mean, that might be great. I also take your point, and I think Rose is certainly by implication as well. What we don't want this is to be threatening directly to anybody in the alliance. That doesn't mean we may not, call out some things, but we don't want it to descend into the policeman. That's not what this ought to be. This ought to be a vibrant center that we look to as a resource, and sometimes an arbiter, but mostly a resource and an advocate for what we say we believe foundationally. So that we're more aggressively showing people, here's what we stand for and why you might want to emulate it. So it even has a missionary aspect to it. But I just see it in that kind of role. I agree with you, it's operational, but it doesn't mean it couldn't coordinate with like the Romanian Center and other centers as well. But the idea that, while it would be redundant, well, we don't do anything in NATO right now other than rhetoric and statements of commitment, but we don't do anything operationally, and that needs to change. And by the way, if we don't, I'm going to suggest that there will be further erosion for NATO politically in our respective memberships. We saw in the Trump years how easy it was for a leader in the key foundational member to actually question the very raison d'etre of NATO. And, there's a vulnerability here. And the more we can build architecture that everybody can ultimately see is why we exist, and how vital that role is, the more we stabilize and strengthen NATO itself. I don't know, Rose or Dan, if you want to respond to those remarks, and then we'll open it up.
If I could ask also Rose to request the floor again, so we'll bring her up on screen. And in the meantime, let me signal, Mr. President, as well, that the rapporteur, our Vice President Attila Masterhazy, has also requested the floor.
Okay, of course. Rose or Dan, did you want to?
Yeah, Mr. President, you're obviously very well cited on these issues and extremely have done a lot of thinking about them. The doubts I expressed about the institutional mechanism that Mr. Hamilton has suggested is my concern that it would essentially get buried in PASP and would not serve the role that you are hoping it could serve. I'm interested in...
You're saying where it's located.
Well, yes, because of, as I said, just the overwhelming agenda of work. In my experience as Deputy Secretary General, PASP was already constantly complaining that they could not cover the world and that they had scarce personnel resources. Of course, that could be rectified. You could propose specific personnel slots to handle a center of this kind. But I am just afraid that it would not have the kind of power that you're looking for as an institutional actor. I'm interested in Mr. Hamilton's notion of an inspector general, perhaps, an independent leadership figure of that kind, although I'm wondering more about how the inspector general could hold sway over NATO membership by contrast with NATO headquarters personnel and leadership. So perhaps, if, with your permission, sir, Mr. Hamilton could say a few words about that. But having some kind of institutional leader who has some independence, I think I could see some value in that, frankly, rather than putting it inside PASP where I fear it would get buried. That's my concern here. The other thing, I really wanted to endorse the 2030 recommendation from the group of senior experts who worked on that, of putting together a code of conduct. I think that would in itself be a good exercise to get the NATO allies gathered around this issue, first of all, as a priority, but number two, then, to really suss out where some of the difficulties will be. I can imagine some of the NATO countries are going to be rather difficult to deal with on these issues, and the exercise of putting together a code of conduct would give us a clear picture. I think we can imagine or guess where the difficult points are going to be and the difficult personalities, but to have a very clear picture of that could be formulated through the process of a code of conduct creation. So those are my comments, Mr. President, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Rose. And Dan, you may want to respond as well.
Yeah, well, she asked especially on the one point, but let me, so I think, whether it's exactly the way I said it, I was putting out ideas, right? That was but I share your view. There has to be some place operational at the heart of NATO that underscores this issue and is constantly looking at it. So whether it's in the, Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs or not, something we can discuss. It seems that when I look at the structure, that seems the most logical place, but I understand it's got to do everything. Another option is to make it, since it's so foundational, again, something separate in the office of the Secretary General itself. But that might subvert sort of, that role. So I'm not hung up on exact, I think my basic point is to agree with you, Mr. President, that you can't only have a Euro-Atlantic center in Romania. You have to have something central to the organization for all the points you mentioned, which I agree with. And I agree with the point where we have to straddle the line. This can't be seen as, the democracy police. It has to be seen as a resource, but tied into the foundations of the alliance, because what distinguishes NATO, after all, from anything else? It is this. This is it. So, we can't step back from that. So on the one specific, on the Inspector General notion, again, many NATO allies have in their ministries of defense or foreign affairs an Inspector General or a similar office. So it's not something new to any particular country. There's been some effort to bring together the Inspector Generals from different defense ministries so they exchange best practice, but that tends to be a technical type of exchange. In my view, the NATO IG would not be, again, the policeman or woman. It would be a mandate to inform on the issues, raise concerns, make recommendations to the Secretary General, because this office would be directly reporting to the Secretary General. It could investigate, could have a power of investigation or a mediation on matters of sort of questionable democratic practice. So it's more of the ombudsman function, as I understand the role of Inspector General, rather than the policing function. It's an additional. My point is that this is such an important topic, resilience. We shouldn't fall into a trap of one particular initiative being pitted against another good, well-meaning initiative. I think we should be doing and considering the spectrum. And that's why I think the Romanian Center could have a really good mandate. But it wouldn't really be the same as having something in NATO itself. And I think that's the important point that I was trying to make.
I believe the Secretary General is going to be asking for an increase from members to the Common Fund. And I can assure you here in the United States that will trigger a debate on this subject. So the issue will be forced in one fashion or another. Attila.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your excellent contributions. It was really interesting. I would like to step back a little bit, because we cannot say now that the whole idea is accepted by all the allies, all the members of the alliance. So it would be very nice if we can talk or debate just about the fact that how can we institutionalize this idea, but we have some debates about the whole idea. And that's my question, that how do you see, because several times I got the feedback from our colleagues that this is not NATO's business. We don't have to do anything with this idea, the resilience of democracy. And of course, they add to this explanation or argumentation that it can weaken the solidarity among NATO member states. If we, judge each other or start to judging each other on the basis of the democratic, base of that country. So how do you see that? How can you cope with this challenge? That does it really weaken the solidarity among NATO members? And what do you say to those who say that this is not NATO's business? It could be a Council of Europe, or could be the OSCE, or could be even the European Union in a certain part, but not NATO. And of course, we had this explanation before with the cyber attacks, or with the terrorism, or with the climate change issues. So we know these kind of argumentation, but still, it's valid among the member states. So that's my question, and thank you very much, Jerry, for the possibility.
Yeah, and look, that's a very fair and candid question, Attila. I know you're actually on our side of that argument, but you have to live with a lot of people who are on the other side. Rose or Dan, would you like to respond?
Well, perhaps I'll just say a few words to begin. Mr. Vice President, it's great to see you again. I would just say, and I constantly make reference to the Washington Treaty, that when a state signs up to become a member of NATO, they sign up to those principles of democratic values and the rule of law that are inscribed in the preamble of the Washington Treaty. So I think we just have to keep reminding members who have questions or their doubts or their current course of action, which is heading, as I said, in the wrong direction in some cases. We just have to remind that this was a basic responsibility that they took on themselves when they agreed to join NATO. And of course, it was a tough decision for new member states to be accepted by the existing member states. So I think everyone had in mind that these responsibilities would be taken very seriously. But the other point I will return to is the point I made in my testimony, that I believe oftentimes the best way to make these points is through quiet diplomacy. I know that Secretary General Stoltenberg, to whom I referred earlier in his skill with quiet diplomacy, spent some years, for example, living in Budapest, has a very good relationship with a number of people there, and has had a very good relationship with President Orban. So I do think my own view of this matter is oftentimes with the member states and with the senior leadership of the member states, the best way to work these issues is quiet diplomacy, sometimes not completely effective. And so there are requirements also to do other kinds of build-up of democratic values inside the alliance. But nevertheless, I think that, in my view, it can be the most efficient and effective way to work these issues actually at the highest level.
Ian?
If I could join in briefly, I would reverse the premise. I would say our inattention to these issues has weakened our solidarity. That, in fact, is now our common security challenge. If we get to the point where we treat our alliance as a transactional bargain, rooted only in mutual defense guarantees, I can almost guarantee in the United States that support for the alliance will fade. I don't believe we can have an alliance that will continue to enjoy popular support in democratic societies unless there's an understanding that this alliance is rooted in an alliance as a alliance of democracies. It's something different than other kinds of alliances. And we've seen over the last few years this devolution, if you will, into a transactional bargaining that's only about how much you pay in or pay out, reduces this into something that's not going to continue to enjoy popular support. I don't believe in the United States, nor I believe in many European countries. I was involved directly in the accession of your country and others to NATO. And, if we reflect on those times and succession since then, in the end, admitting a country into NATO is a political decision. You have a lot of criteria, but in the end, it doesn't matter. In the United States, it's 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. Have to think this country is going to add their strength to ours. It's a judgment call in the end, but it's based on a whole set of things unrelated to the military itself. It's about civilian control of that military. It's about transparency and budgets. It's about democratic principles. All of that feeds into the judgment of a U.S. Senator whether or not this country is going to add value or not. So all of those are fundamentally democratic principles. And when we think about potential new members or partners, this tough love message we have from many of them is you have to create the conditions by which you will be able to join our alliance. My former boss, Dick Holbrook, said, you don't fly to Brussels to pick up the keys to the locker room, you got to do some real hard work. And it's not a favor to NATO to join, it's a favor to your own country to uphold those principles, so that we now have a bigger space in Europe of democracy, secure space where war doesn't happen. That is the premise of a democratic alliance. So I think we should reaffirm our principles and not believe that avoiding them would help our solidarity.
I would just add, the problem with the arguments you're hearing, Attila, is that taken to their logical conclusion, once you become a member, anything goes. You could adopt Putin's authoritarian system and still be a member in good standing of NATO. We don't care, as long as you keep your security commitments. And that's absurd. In fact, that would be the surest way, to Dan's point, of undermining the very core of the alliance itself from within. And so we do have not only the right to hold people accountable, but we even have the obligation. Roxandra, who else we got? If Rose and Dan, if you could just extend just a little bit, I know we're beyond our time, but this has been fascinating, and I want to give others, if you can, the opportunity to participate. Roxandra?
We have two requests, Mr. President, from Lord Campbell and from Vice President Marietta Giannakou.
So why don't we, if it's all right with Rose and Dan, we'll give Rose and Dan the last word. Why don't we have our two questioners tee up their questions, and then Rose and Dan could react to both of them, if that's all right. Lord Campbell. Lord Campbell, you need to unmute.
Ming, we can't hear you.
No.
Now try perhaps without the headset, just to see if that makes any difference, Ming.
Yeah.
We tried earlier.
Unplug the headset, Ming, and see if that works.
And perhaps we can get Marietta in the meantime.
All right, Marietta.
If you have a chat function, maybe you could just type it in.
Yeah. Marietta? If you... Yeah. Welcome.
Really, the reference of Rose about the Washington Treaty is very correct. NATO is not only a military organization, but democratic rules, democratic principles, and respect of human rights are necessary for the well-ranking of the system. My opinion is that Secretary General is responsible to follow this and to see the reality inside the different member states. If in a member state democratic rules are not respected, I think this is a responsibility of the Secretary General. You don't think, Rose and Dan, what do you think about?
Thank you, Marietta. Thank you so much. And hope things are well in Greece. You don't have cicadas. Lord Campbell, are you back with us?
Let's try.
On my screen, he's still...
Yeah, he's still muted. So, Ming, if you hear us, you need to turn on your camera. Yeah, as usual, and microphone. Let's see. Oi.
We had you there for a minute, Ming.
Let's try to get him back. And
Sorry for our technology problems. We now and then, the gremlins get into technology now and then, Rose and Dan, sorry.
and worst case scenario, Ming, call me and I can convey the question. But let's try to get you on screen again, perhaps. Unless you want to start with trying to answer Marietta's question.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Rose or Dan, anyone want to take a crack at Marietta's question and her comment?
Well, again, thank you very much for the question. I'm delighted to see Marietta Giannakou. Very, very nice to see you again, and thanks for the question. I have been saying throughout my testimony and in my remarks that the Secretary General has a special skill, I think, in private diplomacy, which has been an important asset for NATO during this current very troubling period. You cannot guarantee, of course, that every Secretary General will be as skilled as Jens Stoltenberg has been during this period. But I will add, therefore, that I think there is a special responsibility for the Secretary General. I haven't thought about it before, but perhaps there is some kind of need in this period of thinking through whether it's an Inspector General somehow as an independent body, or Dan's proposal of having a center and pass. I was clear in my view that wouldn't be as effective, but perhaps it's a time to think through whether there is some special discourse that should be undertaken with the Secretary General, especially as we are approaching a process of finding the next Secretary General, whether there's some special discourse that should be undertaken with regard to these responsibilities and how it is the Secretary General's role to carry them forward and to work, in my view, through private diplomacy to make as much progress as possible with some of the more difficult allies. But that's a very interesting thought, and I think it should be further pursued. Dan, perhaps you've done some thinking about this already, but it seems to me there's an opportunity now, as we have a recruitment process that will soon launch for the next Secretary General, to think about how to fold this in as an aspect of discourse with the Secretary General. I don't know, to be honest with you, whether the Secretary General has a formal job description, but perhaps it is a time when, if there is such a document, it might be considered whether this should be something that is inscribed in it. So thank you very much, Marietta, for those interesting thoughts, and over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think your point about the Secretary General's role in private diplomacy or discussing issues among allies is really fundamental, actually, to the alliance. I always have to deal with, public audiences. People say, what's NATO about anymore? The Russian, the Soviet Union's gone. Isn't the Cold War over? What's it supposed to be doing now? And I think that betrays a lack of understanding that NATO's role from its very beginning was not only about confronting an external threat, it was about managing relations among allies. If we think about 2 world wars in which European countries are at each other's throats, for them to then join together in a common defense effort required a huge amount of reconciliation skills at that time among each other. And the Secretary Generals at their best have had those skills of managing difficulties among allies to get everybody on board. So it's certainly a huge quality in any Secretary General. This one has been very good at it, and I hope the next one would be equally good. But that means, if we come to our point here about institutional tweaks, to empower the Office of the Secretary General a bit more on some of this. So, I provide a couple suggestions. I think Inspector General, Ombudsman, reporting the Secretary General would be that person's eyes and ears on these issues and can help inform and investigate. As I said, based on our discussion, perhaps a center that involves some of this resource material could also be part of that. So you'd have to resource it, of course, but maybe that's the way to do it rather than have it lower down in the bureaucracy. I'm not hung up on that, but I understand that point. But I think the Secretary General's leadership going forward will be critical on this issue in terms of building an alliance-wide consensus behind these points. So leading the strategic concept review, which can be an open alliance-wide discussion, getting, in my view, to the point where we could agree that comprehensive resilience is the fourth core task of the alliance, because that leads to other conclusions then. You have to have someone with great skill to get some consensus there. So I think the role there is going to be important. As part of the strategic concept review, perhaps this code of conduct mechanism might be a useful venue. And again, where the Secretary General will probably have to lead that, overall building of consensus. So I see going forward a critical role of Secretary General, I think would be quite important.
Thank you so much, Dan and Rose. Sandra, any relief on Lord Campbell?
I know he wanted to try to come back again. So Ming, if you could request the floor, we'll try perhaps one last time.
And this will be the last question.
Ming, so we can't see your request right now. So if you don't mind trying, if not, his question was the link to Article 5, how this discussion on values links up to Article 5 and whether there is a link there.
Okay. Are there implications for Article 5? Is there a linkage to Article 5? Should there be a linkage to Article 5? I think it's Lord Campbell's question. Dan, you want to start?
Yeah, just pushing the right button here.
Yeah.
Well, as I've tried to say, I think NATO has three core tasks, including Article 5 collective defense. If we do a strategic concept review, each of those three core tasks, I think, needs some updating. I think they all actually hold up well, each of them, but they need to be updated to current realities. And the point I was trying to make is that the more resilient allies are, the less resort we might have to make to actually implement, obligations under collective defense. If the more resilient we are, the better able we'll be able to implement that defense, because we will be reliant on critical infrastructures across the alliance. We'll be reliant on the democratic legitimizing procedures that would give authority to any effort at collective defense. It would have to be the democratic underpinning for parliamentary support for forward deployed forces in the alliance, which currently we have. So there are a lot of interrelationships here, and I think it's really quite important.
Thank you, Dan. Rose, you get the last word.
Well, on this particular point, and Lord Campbell, I hadn't thought about this issue before either, and so you are causing my little gray cells to work pretty hard this morning out in California, but I wanted to endorse again what Dan Hamilton had to say. I think those are the areas where you look for linkages, and to think about how there could be both negative but also positive implications, certainly positive implications if democratic resilience is well installed at the alliance, and I do believe those positive linkages would be there, but negative linkages if somehow NATO fails to move forward in improving its performance in this area. So I think you've raised a question that is well worth serious contemplation. I don't have any clear notion at this moment as to recommendations to offer, but I will certainly take it as a task to do so. And as I said, I fully endorse what Dan had to say as the environment that we need to contemplate in thinking through these issues.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking this time, for your commitment to collective freedom and security, and the years you put into NATO as a vibrant alliance. We face new challenges, and we need to prove that we're up to them. We do believe, and I think we violently agree on a lot more than we might disagree, that we have to enshrine democracy as something other than a noble goal to which we aspire. We really have to move operationally and create architecture within NATO so that it is crystal clear why we have the alliance. And as Rose, you pointed out, I mean, it's in the original charter. We are more, as Marietta says, than just a military alliance. So I want to thank you both. And Dan, I think you've given us some thoughtful terrain to explore in terms of how best we might do this and what its assignments might be. I do believe that direct reporting to the Secretary General is going to be important because you know how bureaucracies work, right? I mean, if this is the guardian of the deputy under assistant part-time widget secretary in the bowels of the NATO headquarters in Belgium, all of us know what that means, and this is not a time where we can afford to dilute our democratic commitment. This is a time to enshrine it and elevate it. We have an opportunity, but there are also perils to be met. So we're going to push it, but your testimony, your willingness to hear us out and share your thoughts, just so appreciated. And I assure you, we will revisit them and we will continue this dialogue with each of you as really key allies and resources for our thinking as we move forward. Thank you so much, and thank you for agreeing to go a little bit beyond time. I blame it on the cicadas here in Washington.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. All the best.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
take care. Bye.
Thank you.